Richard Hale, a powerful billionaire known for his cold efficiency, strides through his company's gleaming lobby. Suddenly, he stops mid-step. A young janitor, mopping the marble floor, looks strikingly familiar. Their eyes meet briefly, just seconds, yet enough to stir an unsettling memory Richard believed long forgotten, a ghost from decades past whispering for attention. Richard Hale, a self-made billionaire, commands boardrooms with an iron will, but returns each night to an empty penthouse. His vast wealth hides a life stripped of warmth and family. Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel Brooks scrubs office floors after class, working tirelessly to care for his ailing mother. Unaware of his true parentage, Daniel shoulders every burden alone. Worlds apart from Richard's glittering empire, Richard Hale tried to focus on the meeting agenda, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the young janitor he'd seen in the lobby. That face, it wasn't just familiar, it was haunting. The set of the jaw, the dark, steady eyes, even the way the young man carried himself, something about him pulled at a thread Richard hadn't touched in years. Sitting in his corner, office high above the city, Richard stared out at the skyline, but he wasn't seeing skyscrapers. He was seeing the past. Memories of Anna Brooks, his college sweetheart, surfaced uninvited. She'd vanished suddenly, leaving only a note that said, "I have to do this alone." He never knew what this meant. He never stopped wondering. The resemblance was too strong to ignore. Richard pressed a button on his desk phone. "Cynthia," he said evenly to his assistant, "I want you to find out who the janitor in the lobby is. Quietly. No one needs to know about this." "Any specific reason?" she asked, sensing the uncharacteristic tone in his voice. "Just curiosity," he lied, his usual cold composure slipping for a fraction of a second. "Handle it discreetly. I want his name, his background, everything." As he ended the call, Richard leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin. If his hunch was right, this wasn't coincidence. The thought sent a jolt through him. Not fear exactly, but something deeper. Anticipation, regret, hope he didn't dare name. For the first time in years, business deals and quarterly earnings felt insignificant. Something more personal, more dangerous was knocking at his door. And Richard Hale was a man unaccustomed to being unprepared. Daniel Brooks moved briskly through the quiet, dimly lit corridors of the office building, mop in hand, his sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished floor. It was almost midnight, but he still had another wing to finish before heading home. Sleep was a luxury he rarely afforded himself anymore. Double shifts had become routine, not out of ambition, but necessity. His mother's medical bills piled up faster than his modest paycheck could cover, and every hour of overtime meant keeping the lights on for one more month. The vending machine in the break room hummed softly, almost teasing him. He stopped for a moment, debating whether to spend his last crumpled dollar on a bag of chips. Hunger clawed at his stomach, but he shoved the bill back into his pocket. Mum's prescriptions came first, always. If anyone noticed how much weight he'd lost over the past few months, no one said a word. Despite the exhaustion etched across his face, Daniel never complained. He hated pity, almost as much as he hated asking for help. Pride was the only thing he felt truly belonged to him, pride in doing things on his own terms. Even when his mother, pale and coughing, urged him to slow down, Daniel only smiled and told her he was fine. On weekends, while his friends relaxed or went out, Daniel picked up cleaning jobs at warehouses and small shops. Every dollar mattered. Sometimes he skipped meals entirely to save money, telling his mother he'd eaten at work. He lied with such quiet ease that she almost believed him. Almost. Late at night, in the small apartment they shared, Daniel would sit by her bedside. After finishing his shifts, he'd hold her hand and whisper promises about better days ahead, even if he wasn't sure he believed them himself. When the coughing fits grew worse, his worry deepened, but still, he refused to ask anyone for a loan. To Daniel, accepting charity felt like defeat. He didn't know that his stubborn pride was about to collide with a truth far bigger than unpaid bills, a truth standing in the marble-floored lobby where he worked every evening, hidden inside a man who saw more than Daniel realized. Alone in his penthouse that night, Richard Hale poured himself a glass of scotch and stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city glow beneath him. The janitor's face kept flashing in his mind like a photograph he couldn't put down. That jawline, those eyes. It was impossible not to see Anna Brooks in them. Anna. The name alone stirred something raw. Decades earlier, back in his college days, she had been his anchor. While Richard dreamed of conquering the business world, she reminded him that life was more than ambition and numbers. She laughed easily, loved deeply, and believed in him when no one else did. They'd spent long nights walking across campus, talking about futures that felt limitless. Then, without warning, she was gone. One morning she simply disappeared, leaving a single handwritten note. "I have to do this alone, don't come after me." Richard searched, at first frantically, then methodically. Phone calls, letters, even private investigators. But Anna had vanished as if she'd been swallowed by the earth. The trail went cold, and eventually Richard buried his heartbreak beneath years of work and ruthless ambition. Now, seeing this young janitor, so familiar it hurt, Richard's carefully walled-off past came rushing back. Could this boy be hers? The timing lined up. The resemblance was undeniable. And if Anna had a child, could he also be Richard's? Richard set his drink down, his hand trembling slightly, an unfamiliar crack in his normally unshakable composure. Memories of Anna's soft voice, her quiet strength, and the warmth of her hand in his returned with brutal clarity. He had built an empire to escape feelings like these, to protect himself from the ache of loss. But tonight the walls he'd constructed felt paper-thin. Questions swirled like storm clouds. Why had Anna left? Why hadn't she told him if she was pregnant? And why, after all these years, did fate choose now to place this young man in his path? Richard knew one thing. This was no coincidence. The resemblance was too strong, too precise. He needed answers, not tomorrow, not eventually, but now. Somewhere out there, Anna Brooks had lived a life without him, and standing in his lobby might be the living proof of everything Richard had missed. The next evening, Richard Hale decided to test his suspicion the only way he knew how, face to face. He descended from his private office instead of using the executive elevator, strolling through the marble lobby where the janitorial crew was finishing their shift. Daniel Brooks was wheeling his mop bucket toward the service area, earbuds in, humming faintly to a tune only he could hear. Richard timed his approach carefully, stepping into Daniel's path just as he turned a corner. The collision was gentle but deliberate. "Whoa, sorry, sir," Daniel said immediately, pulling out one earbud. His tone was polite but cautious, the way anyone would speak to a man wearing an immaculate suit and shoes worth more than a month's rent. "No harm done," Richard replied smoothly, offering a small smile. "You work here often?" Daniel gave a short nod, gripping the mop handle like a shield. "Yeah, evening shifts mostly. Keeps the bills paid." He wasn't rude, just reserved, as though used to people barely noticing him unless they were complaining about a spill. Richard studied him closely, noting the sharp eyes, the steady posture, the way he spoke with quiet dignity. "That's good," Richard said, masking his curiosity. "Hard work's an underrated virtue these days. What's your name?" "Daniel," he answered simply. "Daniel Brooks." The surname hit Richard like a quiet thunderclap, though he didn't let it show. He nodded thoughtfully. "Well, Daniel, keep up the good work. People notice effort, even if it doesn't seem like it." Daniel gave a half smile, unsure how to respond. To him, this was just the building's owner making small talk. "Thanks. I just do my job." As Richard walked away, he felt a rush of conflicting emotions, excitement, dread, and something dangerously close to hope. Daniel didn't seem to recognize him at all, which meant Anna had truly kept Richard out of their lives completely. Daniel, meanwhile, returned to his work, shrugging off the strange encounter. To him, it was just another rich man passing through. His world for a brief moment, likely never to think about him again. But Richard was already thinking about Daniel far too much. This wasn't going to be their last conversation. Not by a long shot. Richard Hale didn't waste time. The moment he stepped back into his private office after his encounter with Daniel, he summoned his trusted assistant, Cynthia. Calm on the Surface but restless inside, Richard instructed her to dig into every detail of Daniel Brooks's life: family, education, work history. "Do it quietly," he said. "No one needs to know." Cynthia was efficient, as always. Within 48 hours, she placed a folder on Richard's polished mahogany desk. "You were right to be curious," she said carefully. Watching his reaction, Richard opened the folder and scanned the documents, his heart pounding despite years of mastering his emotions. Daniel Brooks, age 23. Lives with his mother. Anna Brooks. No record of a father on the birth certificate. Anna never married. No known siblings. Daniel was born exactly 9 months after the last time Richard had seen Anna. For a long moment, Richard just stared at the papers. The neat black print seemed to blur. It wasn't just a hunch anymore, it was almost certain. Anna had disappeared carrying his child. Their child. Cynthia hesitated before speaking again. "Sir, do you want me to find out more about the mother? Where she's living now?" Richard looked up sharply. "Yes, everything. Where she is, her health, her work. Anything you can find. And keep it off the books." His voice was steady, but there was a tremor of urgency in it she'd never heard before. That night, Richard sat alone in his penthouse, the city lights stretching endlessly below. The truth was both exhilarating and crushing. Why hadn't Anna told him? Why had she raised Daniel alone, struggling while he built an empire? He could have provided everything: money, education, security. But instead, his son mopped office floors to keep his mother alive. He poured himself a drink but barely touched it. For a man who always had answers, Richard now had only questions. Finding Daniel's mother wasn't just about confirmation anymore. It was about understanding why she'd shut him out, and why fate had waited 23 years to throw them back into each other's lives. And one thing was clear. Richard wasn't going to stop until he had those answers. Richard Hale sat in his darkened office long after everyone had gone home, the city skyline glittering like a taunt through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The folder on his desk confirmed everything he already suspected. Daniel Brooks wasn't just any janitor. He was almost certainly Richard's son, but instead of triumph, an unfamiliar heaviness pressed on his chest. At first, anger flared. How could Anna have kept this from him? She'd vanished without a word, leaving him to believe she'd simply fallen out of love. All those sleepless nights in college, searching for her number, calling mutual friends, even hiring a private investigator. He'd tried, but clearly not hard enough. He had let his ambition distract him, burying himself in business when the trail went cold. Now the years he'd missed hit him like a punch. Daniel's childhood birthdays, his first day of school, the scraped knees and science projects. Richard hadn't been there for any of it. While Richard closed billion-dollar deals and built towers with his name on them, his son scrubbed floors to keep his mother alive. The guilt was corrosive, eating away at the steel exterior Richard had spent decades forging. Yet alongside anger and regret lurked fear, an emotion Richard Hale wasn't used to feeling. What if Daniel wanted nothing to do with him? What if he hated him for being absent all these years? Richard could picture it vividly. The young man's cold stare, the word father sounding like an insult. He swirled a glass of untouched scotch, staring at the amber liquid as though it held answers. For the first time in decades, Richard felt powerless. Money couldn't buy back lost time. Influence couldn't erase a lifetime of absence. Even if Anna forgave him, would Daniel? And did Richard deserve that forgiveness at all? The questions haunted him long into the night. He had built an empire by never hesitating, by making decisions swiftly and decisively. But this wasn't a merger or an acquisition. This was his son. And Richard had no idea how to bridge 23 lost years without breaking everything in the process. For the first time, the man who always controlled the game felt like he might already be losing. 2 days after confirming Daniel's identity, Richard decided to approach him again, but this time with a plan. He couldn't simply blurt out the truth. Daniel didn't know him, didn't trust him, and Richard wasn't sure how he'd react to learning that the billionaire who owned the building was also his father. So Richard devised a softer approach, one that looked like simple generosity, rather than personal interest. He waited until late evening, when the office building was nearly empty. Daniel was lugging a heavy bag of cleaning supplies down a corridor when Richard appeared, his tailored suit sharply contrasting with the janitor's worn uniform. "Daniel, isn't it?" Richard asked casually. "I've been hearing good things. About you. You take pride in your work, that's rare." Daniel paused, wary. Compliments from men in $1,000 suits usually came with strings attached. "I just do my job, sir." Richard smiled faintly. "That's exactly what I mean. I'd like to offer you a position with better pay, senior maintenance, day shifts, benefits. You've earned it." Daniel blinked, clearly surprised. A promotion like that could solve a lot of problems, but he hesitated, shoulders stiffening. "I appreciate it, but I can't take something I didn't apply for. There are guys who've been here longer than me. Wouldn't be right." The refusal was polite, but firm. Richard studied him carefully, hiding his admiration. Most young men would have jumped at the chance. But Daniel's pride was unshakable. He wanted to stand on his own, not feel like he owed anyone. "I understand," Richard said smoothly. "Just know the offer stands. People like you deserve recognition." Daniel nodded cautiously. "Thanks, sir, but I'm fine where I am." As Richard walked away, he couldn't help but feel an unexpected swell of respect. This wasn't a kid looking for handouts. This was his son, a man who'd inherited more of Richard's grit than he realized. In that moment, Richard knew he couldn't simply throw money at the situation. Winning Daniel's trust would take patience, honesty, and something Richard rarely gave anyone: humility. For perhaps the first time in his life, Richard Hale was impressed not by wealth or power, but by character. Daniel Brooks had returned home late after another grueling shift. His body ached, his stomach growled, and yet he barely noticed his own exhaustion. All his focus was on his mother, Anna, sitting quietly in the living room with a blanket wrapped around her frail shoulders. Her breathing was shallow, and her once bright eyes seemed duller than usual. He tried to coax her into taking her medication, but her hands trembled too much to manage the tiny pills. "Mom, please." "Just take it," Daniel urged softly, his voice tight with worry. Anna gave a weak smile, trying to reassure him, but the cough that followed was violent, rattling her chest. Daniel's heart lurched. He had seen her health decline steadily over the past few months, but tonight something felt different. It was urgent, terrifying. Without hesitation, Daniel scooped her into his arms, ignoring the pain in his own back. The walk to the car was a blur. Every red light, every delay felt like an eternity. The city streets, usually familiar, now seemed menacing, as though time itself was conspiring against him. At the hospital, doctors hustled her into an examination room, and Daniel's hands shook as he filled out forms. The mounting bills, the cost of tests, and the medicines he could barely afford pressed down on him like a weight too heavy to lift. He had taken out loans, borrowed from friends, and sacrificed everything he could, but it never seemed enough. Sitting beside Anna, he held her hand, feeling the fragility of her body beneath his palm. Memories of her sacrifices flooded his mind, raising him alone, keeping the apartment warm, making sure he never went to bed hungry. And now the roles had reversed, leaving him desperate to protect her, powerless against the relentless demands of the world. Tears pricked his eyes as he promised himself silently that he would find a way. He would figure it out, he always did. But, at that moment, the fear gnawed at him, threatening to overwhelm the strength he clung to. Every grimace, every cough from his mother reminded him that time was slipping through their fingers, and he couldn't afford to waste another second. Daniel clenched her hand tightly, drawing strength from her presence. Though he knew the fight wasn't just for survival, it was for dignity, for love, and for the fragile thread of hope that still held their lives together. Tonight, the world had pressed them to the edge, and Daniel felt the full weight of being both son and caretaker in one fragile, exhausting heartbeat. Late at night, the hospital corridors were quiet, except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the distant beeping of monitors. Richard Hale parked his car a block away, refusing to call attention to himself. He didn't need anyone knowing he was here, not Daniel, not Anna, not even the nurses who passed him in the hall. He had seen enough in the lobby and through background checks to confirm that Daniel's mother was indeed Anna Brooks. But seeing her in person, frail and fragile, was something entirely different. Richard's usually sharp mind faltered as he watched her from a shadowed corner. Her hair, once thick and vibrant, now fell thinly across her shoulders. Her eyes, which had once held fire and laughter, now seemed weary, weighed down by years of struggle and illness. Richard's chest tightened. He remembered her in her youth, laughing under the sun, filled with energy and hope. And now, decades later, she seemed diminished by time, by hardship, by life's relentless blows. He felt a surge of guilt. If he had only searched harder back then, if he had found her sooner, could he have prevented some of this suffering? The thought was unbearable. Through the thin hospital window, he saw Daniel tending to her, brushing her hair gently, holding her hand with quiet devotion. Richard's admiration for his son grew silently, mixed with a pang of sorrow. Daniel was shouldering burdens that were never meant for him alone. Richard wanted to rush in, reveal himself, offer help, comfort, anything, but he couldn't, not yet. Not when he knew the moment of revelation could shatter Daniel, or worse, push him away permanently. The idea of rejection after 23 years of absence was terrifying. He had built empires, faced competitors, and survived business battles. But this human frailty, this personal vulnerability, was unfamiliar terrain. So Richard lingered in the shadows, watching, feeling helpless. Each cough from Anna, each strained breath tore at him in ways no boardroom victory ever had. After several minutes, he reluctantly stepped back, slipping silently into the night. He had to let Daniel live this moment without interference. He had to find a way to bridge the past and the present carefully, to earn trust before revealing the truth. Driving away, Richard's mind churned with plans, strategies, and emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. One thing was certain: he could no longer ignore them, and the moment to act would come soon. But for tonight, all he could do was watch from a distance, heart heavy with regret and hope intertwined. The next morning, whispers echoed through the janitor's break room like a slow-moving storm. Word had spread quickly. The billionaire, Richard Hale, had personally stopped to speak with Daniel the night before. Some of the older staff raised their eyebrows, while others murmured theories in hushed tones, speculating that Daniel had somehow earned special favor, or worse, was being groomed for something beyond his current position. Daniel walked into the break room, clutching his coffee cup, and immediately felt the shift in atmosphere. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Glances followed him like shadows, and the occasional smirk or subtle nod made him uncomfortable. He wasn't used to attention, let alone from colleagues who usually barely acknowledged his presence beyond casual greetings. He sipped his coffee quietly, trying to act as if nothing had changed. "Did you see him talking to Mr. Hale last night?" One janitor whispered to another, careful to keep their voices low. "Yeah, maybe he's moving up the ranks," another replied, barely containing a smirk. "Guess the boss sees something special in him." Daniel stiffened, forcing a neutral expression. Special? He didn't want special. He didn't want anyone thinking he needed charity or handouts. Pride had been his armor for years, and even subtle attention felt like a threat to it. Trying to focus on the morning tasks, he mopped floors and wiped down surfaces, but the whispers followed him like an invisible echo. Every nod or glance from co-workers made him second-guess himself. Was he doing something differently? Did Richard Hale really mean anything by that conversation, or was it just polite words from a man with too much power and too little understanding of ordinary life? Meanwhile, in a distant office, Richard observed some of the janitors' reactions through the lobby's glass walls. He noted the curiosity, the subtle envy, and Daniel's discomfort. A small part of him smiled, amused, but the larger, more pressing part felt a tug in his chest. His son didn't belong in a world of speculation and assumptions, yet the simple act of noticing him seemed to have stirred tension he hadn't anticipated. Daniel finished his shift, shoulders tense and mind restless. The attention weighed on him more than the physical labor ever could. He longed for the simplicity of his routines, before whispers and assumptions entered the mix. Little did he know these rumors were only the beginning, a quiet prelude to truths that would soon shake the foundation of his life entirely. Richard Hale sat alone in his office late at night, the city lights casting sharp reflections across the glass walls. The encounter with Daniel, the whispered rumors among the janitors, and his visit to Anna at the hospital had stirred something deep within him, a mix of hope, guilt, and fear. He knew in his heart that Daniel was likely his son, but he wanted proof. Solid, undeniable proof. A private DNA test seemed the logical step. He could hire a discreet lab, have Daniel's sample taken without his knowledge, and finally confirm the truth. It would settle everything, remove all doubt, and give him the data he needed to plan his next move. But even as he considered it, a tight knot of unease formed in his stomach. Was it ethical to test someone's DNA without consent, to invade the privacy of a man who had no idea he was a billionaire's son? Richard had always made calculated moves in business, but family was different. This wasn't a merger or an acquisition. This was a human life, a young man who had struggled alone, unaware of the parentage that could change everything. He leaned back in his chair, hands steepled, staring at the polished surface of his desk. The idea of confirming paternity in secret felt like a violation, an intrusion into a life he had missed shaping for 23 years. But the alternative, waiting, relying solely on resemblance and circumstantial evidence, felt equally unbearable. He wanted certainty before he revealed anything, wanted to ensure that when he approached Daniel, he did so with confidence, not hope alone. Richard's mind raced through scenarios. If the DNA test confirmed it, and he revealed the truth too soon, would Daniel reject him? If he delayed and acted without proof, could he ruin the fragile beginnings of trust? And what about Anna, who had raised Daniel alone, shielding him from this reality? He didn't want to repeat past mistakes. Hours passed in the dim light as Richard weighed his options. Every decision seemed fraught with risk, every choice a potential wound to someone he loved but hadn't been allowed to protect. He finally realized that the answer wasn't simple. He needed to balance morality with certainty, patience with action. The DNA test could give him answers, but at what cost? For the first time in his life, Richard Hale faced a decision where logic and power offered no guarantees, only the delicate, uncertain territory of the heart. Daniel Brooks had always been resilient, but even resilience has its limits. Rent notices, stacked on the kitchen counter, electricity bills left unpaid, and pharmacy statements printed in alarming red ink, all reminders of how precarious their life had become. Each notice was a knife, cutting deeper into his pride. He'd exhausted every legitimate option, and yet the looming threat of eviction made every day feel like a countdown. The apartment they shared was small, cramped, and barely furnished. But it was Anna's home and Daniel's anchor. The thought of losing it, of his mother being uprooted, of all their hard-fought stability collapsing, gnawed at him relentlessly. With no safety net, Daniel's nights grew longer, and his work, days heavier. He picked up extra shifts in other office buildings, sometimes arriving before dawn to finish cleaning before heading to his main job. Every spare minute was consumed with survival. Eventually, the legitimate work wasn't enough. Daniel started taking on night cleaning jobs in abandoned warehouses and empty factories. These were dangerous places, structurally unsound buildings, dimly lit spaces, and occasional encounters with petty criminals or drifters seeking shelter. He knew the risks, but the alternative, inaction, was unthinkable. With every creaking floorboard and shattered window, adrenaline mixed with dread, forcing him to focus on the task at hand rather than the exhaustion pressing down on his shoulders. Even as he scrubbed floors under flickering lights, Daniel felt the weight of responsibility crushing him. His mother depended on him entirely, and the idea of letting her down was unbearable. Yet in every aching muscle, every cut from broken glass, every missed meal, he found a flicker of determination. He refused to let life defeat them. Not yet. One night, after finishing an especially grueling warehouse shift, Daniel collapsed onto the cracked concrete floor, drenched in sweat and trembling from fatigue. He stared at the ceiling, shadows dancing across peeling paint, and for the first time allowed himself a moment of fear. What if he failed? What if all his efforts weren't enough to keep them afloat? And yet, even in that despair, Daniel pushed himself up, tightening the straps on his worn-out backpack, and whispered to himself, "We'll get through this. I have to." Every step he took, every job he risked his safety for, was a testament to the unbreakable bond between him and his mother, and the fierce determination to survive against all odds. Daniel Brooks was working the late-night shift in one of the older, dimly lit office wings of the building. His hands were raw from scrubbing stubborn stains, and the concrete floors had become slick with cleaning solution. Every step required concentration, every movement calculated to avoid accidents. But exhaustion had weakened his focus. One misstep, a slip on the wet floor, sent him sprawling violently, the mop flying out of his hands. Pain exploded in his leg, sharp and unforgiving. He groaned, trying to push himself up, but the injury was severe. He could barely move. Panic set in as he realized he couldn't reach his cell phone. The corridors were eerily silent. And no one else was on duty at this hour. The hospital bills, the unpaid rent, the looming debt, all of it rushed back to him in a flood of anxiety. For a moment, the weight of life pressed down so heavily that he feared he wouldn't be able to bear. Then, as if fate intervened, Richard Hale appeared at the end of the hallway, conducting one of his rare impromptu inspection rounds. His eyes immediately locked on Daniel, sprawled on the floor, a flash of concern crossing his usually composed face. Without hesitation, he strode forward, crouching beside the young man. "Daniel, are you okay?" Richard's voice was sharp, but laced with worry. Daniel shook his head, gritting his teeth against the pain. "I slipped my leg," he managed to say, voice strained. Richard didn't wait. He lifted Daniel carefully, balancing him with surprising strength and determination. "We're getting you to the hospital, now," he said firmly. Daniel's protests were weak. Exhaustion and shock had rendered him compliant. In moments they were in the car, Richard driving with precision, eyes flicking between the road and Daniel's pale, sweating face. At the hospital, doctors quickly assessed the injury. Nothing life-threatening, but severe enough to require immediate care. Daniel's pride struggled against his gratitude, but Richard remained calm, insisting on handling the admission and payment details himself. Watching Daniel's discomfort and silent pain stirred something inside Richard that he couldn't ignore. A protective, urgent instinct he hadn't felt in decades. For Daniel, the incident was terrifying, but for Richard it was a revelation. He realized more than ever that his son's life was fragile in ways money alone could not shield, and that he could no longer remain a distant observer. In that hospital corridor, a bridge between past mistakes and future redemption, quietly, began to form. The fluorescent lights of the hospital room were harsh, but Anna Brooks barely noticed. She had drifted in and out of consciousness through the pain and medication until the door quietly opened and a familiar figure stepped inside. Her eyes widened, heart skipping a beat. Richard Hale, the man she had loved, the man she had left behind decades ago. "Richard," she breathed, disbelief and a flicker of old affection mingling in her voice. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of why he was here. The lines of his face were sharper now, the years of power and wealth etched into every feature. But the eyes, the same eyes that had once promised her the world, looked concerned. Richard didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Anna, I know about Daniel," he said quietly but firmly. "He's my son." Anna's face paled. The words hit her like a tidal wave. For years she had kept her secret, raising Daniel alone, protecting him from a world that could have turned complicated very quickly. And now Richard knew all the careful plans, all the sacrifices suddenly felt exposed. You knew?" she asked, voice trembling. "All these years? Did you ever think to find us?" Her pain was raw, a mixture of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. "Do you know what it was like, Richard? Raising him alone, watching bills pile up, fighting to keep him safe while you built your empire? Did you ever care?" Richard flinched. At her words, guilt tightening in his chest. "I searched, Anna. I tried. I never stopped wondering. I thought I had failed to find you, but I never stopped hoping." Anna's tears fell freely now, frustration spilling over. "You don't understand. I left to protect him. I wanted him to grow up without knowing the father who wasn't there." Richard stepped closer, voice softening. "I see that now. And I'm here, Anna. I want to help in any way I can. I've made mistakes. So many mistakes. But I won't make any more if you let me." The room was heavy with unspoken words and old wounds. Memories of love, loss, and separation clashed violently, making both of them tremble with emotion. Anna wanted to forgive, to trust, but years of pain had built walls stronger than any force of will. Richard's presence forced her to confront the past, to wrestle with choices she thought she had buried forever. For the first time in decades, father and mother, and a life they had built apart, stood at the crossroads of reconciliation, their shared history both a bridge and a battlefield. The air between them was tense, charged, and impossible to ignore. Richard Hale stood at the foot of Anna's hospital bed, his polished shoes silent against the linoleum floor. He had rehearsed what to say 100 times in his head, but none of it captured the urgency he felt now. Seeing Anna frail, vulnerable, and yet fiercely protective of her son, ignited a desperate resolve in him. He had waited too long, and he couldn't remain silent any longer. "Anna," Richard began, his voice low but insistent, "I need you to let me tell him. Daniel deserves to know the truth. He deserves to know who I am." Anna's hands clutched the thin hospital blanket tightly. "No, Richard, you don't understand. You've been gone all these years. He trusts me. He doesn't need a billionaire. Father complicating his life. He's happy in his routines, proud of his independence. Don't take that from him." Richard shook his head, frustration bubbling under his calm exterior. "You think I want to disrupt him? I never stopped thinking about him, Anna. I never stopped wondering if he was safe, if he had what he needed. This isn't about money or power. It's about being a father. Something I was robbed of, yes, but now I can't ignore it." Anna's eyes glistened with tears, her voice tight with emotion. "Do you think I wanted this, Richard? Raising him alone, protecting him from the past, hiding the truth. I did it to shield him from disappointment, from knowing what he might have missed out on. He doesn't need to know you now. It could shatter everything we've worked for." Richard took a cautious step closer, lowering his voice to a soft plea. "I won't force him. I won't make him love me or accept me. I just need the chance. To be honest, to let him decide for himself. You've carried this burden alone for too long, Anna. Let me help, even if it's just a chance to make amends." Anna's hands trembled as she considered his words. She had spent decades shielding Daniel from the pain of absence, but the intensity in Richard's eyes mirrored the love and desperation she recognized from their youth. Her mind raced. Could Daniel handle the truth? Could she trust Richard? Not to shatter the life they had fought so hard to protect. The room was silent, except for the soft beep of monitors and their shared, tense breaths. Richard's plea hung in the air, insistent, vulnerable, and impossible to ignore. For the first time, Anna faced the choice of letting go of the past, or continuing to carry it alone, at the risk of denying both father and son a future they had never known. Daniel Brooks had just returned to the hospital late one evening, hoping for a quiet moment with his mother after another exhausting day. The fluorescent lights cast long shadows across the hallway as he walked toward her room, earbuds in, mind focused on her condition. But just as he turned a corner, he heard voices, one familiar, the other unfamiliar, carrying through the slightly ajar door of a nearby supply room. "Yes, everything's confirmed," Cynthia's voice said. Daniel's ears perked up instantly. Daniel Brooks, Anna Brooks, born exactly 9 months after Mr. Hale last saw her. I've cross-referenced every record. It's all there. A nurse responded, quiet but curious. "So, he really is serious about this. He wants to know everything." Daniel froze. His heart pounded in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to turn and walk away, but his mind refused to ignore what he'd just heard. He wasn't imagining it. Richard had been investigating him, digging into his life without his knowledge, possibly for weeks. Betrayal washed over him in a wave so intense he nearly staggered. His father, or the man who might be his father, had been quietly prying into the most personal parts of his life, treating him like a case study rather than a person. Daniel's fists clenched as fury bubbled beneath the surface. How could he have been so naive, thinking Richard's interest was simple recognition of his work ethic? His mind raced. The anonymous visits, the sudden attention, the mysterious compliments, all pieces of a puzzle he hadn't wanted to see. And now he did. Every sense of trust he had felt, every shred of curiosity that had softened his defenses toward the billionaire, felt like it had been twisted into deceit. Daniel's steps became measured, almost silent, as he retreated down the hall. He needed to process this revelation, to understand how deeply Richard's investigation had intruded on his life. Questions swirled endlessly. Did Richard know he was his father? Had Anna told him anything, or was Richard learning the truth on his own terms? And most importantly, what did it mean for Daniel? If the truth came out now, would it destroy everything he had built with his mother? By the time he reached Anna's room, his hands were trembling, his jaw tight with suppressed anger. He stood quietly beside her bed, gripping the edge of the mattress, and vowed that he wouldn't let anyone, including Richard, interfere in their lives without consent. The trust between father, son, and mother, fragile as it was, had just been tested, and Daniel's patience, pride, and sense of independence had never felt more threatened. Daniel Brooks stormed into the building lobby the next morning, tension coiling in his chest like a spring about to snap. Every whispered rumor, every odd glance from co-workers, and now the revelation he had overheard the night before, had pushed him to the edge. He needed answers, and he needed them from the one person who had caused this whirlwind of confusion. Richard, Hale, unsuspecting, was reviewing some documents in his office, eyes scanning financial reports with the precision only decades of business acumen could provide. Daniel's footsteps echoed down the marble corridor, each step heavier with anger and disbelief. Finally, he reached the door and pushed it open without knocking. "Why do you care?" Daniel demanded, voice tight, eyes flashing. "Why should a billionaire like you care about a janitor like me? You've spent your life building empires, so why dig into mine?" Richard looked up, startled by the intensity of Daniel's tone. He saw the fire in the young man's eyes, the righteous fury, and realized that he couldn't soften the truth with politeness or corporate finesse. There was no subtlety left to employ. I didn't mean to pry," Richard began, choosing his words carefully, but Daniel cut him off. "No, don't give me that. I know you've been investigating me, my life, my mother, all of it." "Why?" Daniel's hands shook, a mix of anger and betrayal coursing through him. Richard swallowed hard, the weight of 23 years of absence pressing down on him. He could no longer tiptoe around the truth, not with Daniel's heart pounding in front of him, vulnerable yet furious. He took a deep breath and let the words escape. "Because I'm your father," Richard blurted out, the words hanging in the room like a lightning strike. Daniel froze, his face draining of color. The words collided with him with the force of a storm, leaving him trembling, incredulous. What did you just say?" he stammered, unable to fully comprehend the confession. Richard nodded, eyes steady, though filled with emotion. "I know it's a lot. I know I've been absent. I've made mistakes, terrible mistakes. But it's true. You're my son." Daniel backed away, hands clenching into fists. A whirlwind of emotions crashing over him, anger, shock, disbelief, confusion, and a raw, aching sense of betrayal. He had grown up believing he was alone, that his father had abandoned him. And now the truth was thrust upon him in one irrepressible, earth-shattering moment. For a long silence, they simply stared at each other, father and son, two lives intertwined by fate, guilt, and love, yet separated by decades of absence and unspoken words. Daniel Brooks backed away, his fists still clenched, chest heaving with a mixture of shock and rage. The words Richard Hale had just spoken, words that should have offered clarity and connection, only fueled the storm inside him. "No," Daniel spat, his voice trembling. "You're lying. You're just another rich man trying to play games with people's lives. You don't care about me. You never have." Richard flinched, not from the accusation itself, but from the raw emotion behind it. He had expected skepticism, perhaps even anger, but not the intensity of betrayal that radiated from Daniel. For years he had built walls of control around himself, but now in front of his own son, those walls seemed fragile, irrelevant. "You don't understand," Richard began, taking a cautious step forward, trying to calm Daniel's flaring temper. "I've searched for you for decades. I've saved it," Daniel barked, cutting him off. "I've heard enough excuses. You had a choice, Richard. You could have found us. You could have been there, but you weren't. And now, after all these years, you suddenly care? You suddenly show up when it's convenient, or when you finally dig up the truth." Richard's hands were raised in a gesture of surrender, but his heart ached with every word. "It's not about convenience, Daniel. It's about making things right as much as I can. I didn't want to force anything. Daniel shook his head violently, stepping back, his eyes glinting with unshed tears. "You think your money, your power, or your apologies can erase the life I've had to fight for myself? You think you can just waltz in and fix everything? I don't need a billionaire father meddling in my life." The air between them crackled, with tension, heavy and suffocating. Daniel's voice, sharp with anger, echoed through the office, leaving Richard momentarily speechless. The man who had controlled boardrooms, negotiated billion-dollar deals, and faced adversaries with composure, now felt powerless in the face of his son's fury. Daniel's mind raced, hurt and disbelief, clouding every rational thought. How could the man he had only recently glimpsed in passing be the father who had been absent all his life? How could he trust someone who had been absent, who had allowed his mother to struggle alone, and who now stood before him expecting forgiveness? Without another word, Daniel turned sharply and left the office, leaving Richard standing there, stunned and reeling. The rejection cut deeper than any boardroom loss, more sharply than any professional failure. For Richard, this was uncharted territory, facing the consequences of absence and realizing that even love could not immediately bridge decades of lost time. Days passed in tense silence. Daniel avoided the building when he could, and Richard respected the space, though the ache of absence and longing never left him. He knew Daniel needed time, but time alone wouldn't erase suspicion or pain. Finally, Richard decided to take a different approach, one that combined patience with undeniable evidence. He arranged a quiet meeting in his office, closing the door to the bustling city outside. The walls, lined with awards and photographs of past business triumphs, were meaningless in this moment. Richard placed a stack of old photographs and letters carefully on the polished oak table. He gestured to them, his eyes locking with Daniel's. "These belong to your mother," Richard said softly, voice calm but urgent. "Letters she never sent, photographs she kept hidden. I found them while researching the past, trying to understand whence to find you." Daniel's hands shook as he picked up the first photograph. There they were, Anna and Richard, young and radiant, standing side by side on a sunlit campus lawn. The smiles were familiar, innocent, and full of promise. He flipped through the stack, each image telling a story of a past he had never known, but somehow recognized in the depth of their intimacy. Then came the letters. Written in Anna's flowing script, they spoke of love, hope, and a choice she felt forced to make. Each word resonated painfully, revealing the sacrifices she had made to protect Daniel from heartbreak, to shield him from a father who was absent. Not for lack of love, but for circumstances beyond her control. Daniel read in silence, his chest tightening with a mix of disbelief and sorrow. The evidence was irrefutable. Every photograph, every letter confirmed what Richard had said. He was telling the truth. And yet the revelation brought no comfort, only a deeper ache. How could you let us live like this?" Daniel finally asked, voice breaking. 23 years without a word, without a single attempt to reach us. And now you show up and expect... What? Forgiveness? Richard's eyes glistened. "I made terrible mistakes. I should have searched harder. I should have never let you grow up without knowing me. I can't change the past, Daniel, but I can try to be here now if you'll let me." Daniel lowered the photographs, anger and pain warring with a reluctant understanding. The proof was undeniable, yet it could not erase the years of absence, the struggle, or the sense of betrayal that had built into the foundation of his life. For now, knowledge had arrived, but trust, Daniel realized, would take far longer to rebuild. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Daniel avoided the office entirely, refusing to see Richard, refusing even to answer calls or messages. Every encounter with the billionaire only intensified his anger and distrust. The proof had been there. Photographs, letters, undeniable evidence. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. How could a man claim to be his father after 23 years of absence? The gulf between them felt insurmountable. Instead, Daniel poured all his energy into his mother. Anna's condition had worsened, her frailty now alarming even to those who had watched her decline gradually over the years. Each day was a careful balancing act, ensuring she took her medications, keeping track of doctor's appointments, and managing the hospital bills that seemed to grow with every test. The exhaustion was relentless, but Daniel refused to let it show. He had long since become the caretaker, the protector, and he wasn't about to let anyone, not even Richard, interfere with that role. Richard, meanwhile, respected Daniel's distance but could not ignore the gnawing ache in his chest. He watched from afar, unable to help directly without pushing the young man further away. He had the resources, the influence, the means to make life easier for both Daniel and Anna, but every act of intervention risked deepening the rift he desperately wanted to bridge. Every passing hour reminded him of the years lost, the milestones missed, and the emotional walls that had been built over decades. Daniel's focus became a narrow, intense tunnel. Hospital rooms, medications, doctor's instructions, all consumed his days. He barely slept, subsisted on quick meals, and carried a weight that threatened to crush him physically and emotionally. And yet, even in his exhaustion, there was a quiet determination. He would not allow anyone to take agency over his mother or their lives, no matter who claimed to be family. At night, as he sat by Anna's bedside, he watched her shallow breathing and whispered promises under his breath. "We'll get through this, Mom. I'll keep you safe." He did not speak of Richard, did not acknowledge the looming presence of a father he couldn't yet accept. In these moments, the silent rift between father and son remained unbridged, a chasm filled with mistrust, grief, and unspoken questions. For Daniel, the world had shrunk to the small hospital room, his mother's fragile life and the fierce, protective love that refused to let anyone, including Richard, intrude. In the quiet of the night, the unspoken tension hung over them, heavy and immovable, a reminder that even truth, when delivered too late, could not easily heal the wounds of absence. I didn't mean to pry," Richard began, choosing his words carefully, but Daniel cut him off. "No, don't give me that. I know you've been investigating me, my life, my mother, all of it." "Why?" Daniel's hands shook, a mix of anger and betrayal coursing through him. Richard swallowed hard, the weight of 23 years of absence pressing down on him. He could no longer tiptoe around the truth, not with Daniel's heart pounding in front of him, vulnerable yet furious. He took a deep breath and let the words escape. "Because I'm your father," Richard blurted out, the words hanging in the room like a lightning strike. Daniel froze, his face draining of color. The words collided with him with the force of a storm, leaving him trembling, incredulous. What did you just say?" he stammered, unable to fully comprehend the confession. Richard nodded, eyes steady, though filled with emotion. "I know it's a lot. I know I've been absent. I've made mistakes, terrible mistakes. But it's true. You're my son." Daniel backed away, hands clenching into fists. A whirlwind of emotions crashing over him, anger, shock, disbelief, confusion, and a raw, aching sense of betrayal. He had grown up believing he was alone, that his father had abandoned him. And now the truth was thrust upon him in one irrepressible, earth-shattering moment. For a long silence, they simply stared at each other, father and son, two lives intertwined by fate, guilt, and love, yet separated by decades of absence and unspoken words. Daniel Brooks backed away, his fists still clenched, chest heaving with a mixture of shock and rage. The words Richard Hale had just spoken, words that should have offered clarity and connection, only fueled the storm inside him. "No," Daniel spat, his voice trembling. "You're lying. You're just another rich man trying to play games with people's lives. You don't care about me. You never have." Richard flinched, not from the accusation itself, but from the raw emotion behind it. He had expected skepticism, perhaps even anger, but not the intensity of betrayal that radiated from Daniel. For years he had built walls of control around himself, but now in front of his own son, those walls seemed fragile, irrelevant. "You don't understand," Richard began, taking a cautious step forward, trying to calm Daniel's flaring temper. "I've searched for you for decades. I've saved it," Daniel barked, cutting him off. "I've heard enough excuses. You had a choice, Richard. You could have found us. You could have been there, but you weren't. And now, after all these years, you suddenly care? You suddenly show up when it's convenient, or when you finally dig up the truth." Richard's hands were raised in a gesture of surrender, but his heart ached with every word. "It's not about convenience, Daniel. It's about making things right as much as I can. I didn't want to force anything. Daniel shook his head violently, stepping back, his eyes glinting with unshed tears. "You think your money, your power, or your apologies can erase the life I've had to fight for myself? You think you can just waltz in and fix everything? I don't need a billionaire father meddling in my life." The air between them crackled, with tension, heavy and suffocating. Daniel's voice, sharp with anger, echoed through the office, leaving Richard momentarily speechless. The man who had controlled boardrooms, negotiated billion-dollar deals, and faced adversaries with composure, now felt powerless in the face of his son's fury. Daniel's mind raced, hurt and disbelief, clouding every rational thought. How could the man he had only recently glimpsed in passing be the father who had been absent all his life? How could he trust someone who had been absent, who had allowed his mother to struggle alone, and who now stood before him expecting forgiveness? Without another word, Daniel turned sharply and left the office, leaving Richard standing there, stunned and reeling. The rejection cut deeper than any boardroom loss, more sharply than any professional failure. For Richard, this was uncharted territory, facing the consequences of absence and realizing that even love could not immediately bridge decades of lost time. Days passed in tense silence. Daniel avoided the building when he could, and Richard respected the space, though the ache of absence and longing never left him. He knew Daniel needed time, but time alone wouldn't erase suspicion or pain. Finally, Richard decided to take a different approach, one that combined patience with undeniable evidence. He arranged a quiet meeting in his office, closing the door to the bustling city outside. The walls, lined with awards and photographs of past business triumphs, were meaningless in this moment. Richard placed a stack of old photographs and letters carefully on the polished oak table. He gestured to them, his eyes locking with Daniel's. "These belong to your mother," Richard said softly, voice calm but urgent. "Letters she never sent, photographs she kept hidden. I found them while researching the past, trying to understand whence to find you." Daniel's hands shook as he picked up the first photograph. There they were, Anna and Richard, young and radiant, standing side by side on a sunlit campus lawn. The smiles were familiar, innocent, and full of promise. He flipped through the stack, each image telling a story of a past he had never known, but somehow recognized in the depth of their intimacy. Then came the letters. Written in Anna's flowing script, they spoke of love, hope, and a choice she felt forced to make. Each word resonated painfully, revealing the sacrifices she had made to protect Daniel from heartbreak, to shield him from a father who was absent. Not for lack of love, but for circumstances beyond her control. Daniel read in silence, his chest tightening with a mix of disbelief and sorrow. The evidence was irrefutable. Every photograph, every letter confirmed what Richard had said. He was telling the truth. And yet the revelation brought no comfort, only a deeper ache. How could you let us live like this?" Daniel finally asked, voice breaking. 23 years without a word, without a single attempt to reach us. And now you show up and expect... What? Forgiveness? Richard's eyes glistened. "I made terrible mistakes. I should have searched harder. I should have never let you grow up without knowing me. I can't change the past, Daniel, but I can try to be here now if you'll let me." Daniel lowered the photographs, anger and pain warring with a reluctant understanding. The proof was undeniable, yet it could not erase the years of absence, the struggle, or the sense of betrayal that had built into the foundation of his life. For now, knowledge had arrived, but trust, Daniel realized, would take far longer to rebuild. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Daniel avoided the office entirely, refusing to see Richard, refusing even to answer calls or messages. Every encounter with the billionaire only intensified his anger and distrust. The proof had been there. Photographs, letters, undeniable evidence. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. How could a man claim to be his father after 23 years of absence? The gulf between them felt insurmountable. Instead, Daniel poured all his energy into his mother. Anna's condition had worsened, her frailty now alarming even to those who had watched her decline gradually over the years. Each day was a careful balancing act, ensuring she took her medications, keeping track of doctor's appointments, and managing the hospital bills that seemed to grow with every test. The exhaustion was relentless, but Daniel refused to let it show. He had long since become the caretaker, the protector, and he wasn't about to let anyone, not even Richard, interfere with that role. Richard, meanwhile, respected Daniel's distance but could not ignore the gnawing ache in his chest. He watched from afar, unable to help directly without pushing the young man further away. He had the resources, the influence, the means to make life easier for both Daniel and Anna, but every act of intervention risked deepening the rift he desperately wanted to bridge. Every passing hour reminded him of the years lost, the milestones missed, and the emotional walls that had been built over decades. Daniel's focus became a narrow, intense tunnel. Hospital rooms, medications, doctor's instructions, all consumed his days. He barely slept, subsisted on quick meals, and carried a weight that threatened to crush him physically and emotionally. And yet, even in his exhaustion, there was a quiet determination. He would not allow anyone to take agency over his mother or their lives, no matter who claimed to be family. At night, as he sat by Anna's bedside, he watched her shallow breathing and whispered promises under his breath. "We'll get through this, Mom. I'll keep you safe." He did not speak of Richard, did not acknowledge the looming presence of a father he couldn't yet accept. In these moments, the silent rift between father and son remained unbridged, a chasm filled with mistrust, grief, and unspoken questions. For Daniel, the world had shrunk to the small hospital room, his mother's fragile life and the fierce, protective love that refused to let anyone, including Richard, intrude. In the quiet of the night, the unspoken tension hung over them, heavy and immovable, a reminder that even truth, when delivered too late, could not easily heal the wounds of absence. Richard Hale sat alone in his office, the city skyline glowing through the windows like 1,000 distant stars. He had tried conversation, intervention, even gentle persuasion, but Daniel remained distant, consumed by his mother's illness and the anger that decades of absence had seeded. Richard knew words spoken in person could be met with resistance, disbelief, or fury. He needed a different approach, one that gave Daniel the space to process, reflect, and perhaps slowly understand. He reached for thick stationery and a fine fountain pen, letting the ink flow slowly as his thoughts crystallized. The letter began cautiously, with a simple acknowledgement. The years lost, the mistakes made, and the absence he could never undo. He wrote about his search for Anna, the desperate months and years when he wondered if they were safe, if they were alive, if fate had been cruel enough to separate them forever. Every sentence carried the weight of decades of longing and regret. Richard recounted his thoughts upon discovering Daniel, how every photograph and letter led him to realize the depth of the life he had missed. He did not attempt to justify his absence. There were no excuses that could soften it. Instead, he confessed his failures openly, describing the sleepless nights, the gnawing guilt, and the relentless wish to turn back time, even if only to ease the burdens Anna had borne alone. Then came the most vulnerable part of the letter. Richard explained that he didn't want to intrude, to overwhelm, or to buy love with wealth. He simply wanted the chance to be Daniel's father, not a benefactor, not a distant figurehead, but someone who could guide, support, and stand beside him as a parent. He acknowledged the right Daniel had to reject him, to remain wary, and to protect himself from further disappointment. Richard signed the letter with a simple, heartfelt closing. "I love you, Daniel, and I will wait as long as it takes for you to see me as I hope to be your father and nothing less. With all my heart, Richard." When Daniel finally received the envelope, the handwriting alone caused his chest to tighten. He hesitated, torn between suspicion and curiosity, before breaking the seal. As he read, he felt the layers of anger, betrayal, and mistrust begin to soften just slightly. The words were raw, honest, and impossible to dismiss. Though Daniel's heart still held pain, Richard's letter planted the first seed of understanding, a fragile, tentative bridge toward reconciliation that neither time nor absence could completely erase. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of the monitors, each sound marking the fragile rhythm of Anna Brooks's life. Daniel sat beside her, exhausted from days of vigilance, his hands gripping hers tightly. Her once vibrant face was pale and lined with pain, yet her eyes held the clarity and strength that had guided him for all these years. She sensed that her time was short, and with it, the urgency to impart one final crucial lesson. "Daniel," Anna whispered, her voice weak but deliberate. Her grip on his hand tightened, as if to anchor him to the moment. "I need you to listen to me. Really listen." Daniel leaned closer, his heart heavy, anticipating the words he had feared for so long. "I've always tried to protect you," she continued, tears brimming in her eyes, "from the world, from disappointment, and even from him. But life is too short to hold on to anger and resentment. Richard, your father, he's made mistakes, yes, but he's here now, and he wants to be part of your life." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Mom, I don't know if I can forgive him. How do I even begin after all these years?" Anna's hand brushed gently against his cheek, the gesture filled with tenderness and urgency. "You forgive not for him, Daniel, but for yourself. Carrying bitterness only weighs you down. He's your father, and you've been given a chance to have the family you never knew. Don't waste it. Love isn't perfect, and it's messy, it's late, and sometimes it comes in ways we never expect. But it's still love." Her words hit him like a tidal wave, each one unraveling the anger he had clung to so fiercely. Daniel felt the walls around his heart trembling, the weight of years of distrust slowly shifting. He had been so focused on betrayal, on hurt, on the injustice of absence, that he had almost forgotten the human need for connection, for family, for reconciliation. Anna's breathing grew shallower, but her gaze remained locked on his. "Promise me," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Promise me you'll give him a chance, not for me, for you, for the life you deserve. Don't let fear or pride steal it from you." Tears streamed down Daniel's face as he nodded, unable to speak. Her plea, so filled with love and wisdom, had pierced the armor of his anger. In that moment, he understood that forgiveness wasn't weakness. It was the bridge to healing, to family, to the connection he had long been denied. Anna's final words became a guiding light, igniting a hope he hadn't dared to feel until now. After Anna's emotional plea, Daniel sat alone in his apartment, staring at the framed photograph of his mother on the small kitchen table. Her last words echoed in his mind, reverberating against the walls he had built around his heart. He thought of the letter Richard had sent, the photographs, the evidence, everything undeniable yet still complicated by years of absence and betrayal. The anger and hurt were still there, but a fragile curiosity began to flicker. Finally, he made a decision, not forgiveness, not acceptance, not yet, but a willingness to listen. Daniel called Richard and asked to meet privately, insisting it was only to hear his side of the story, nothing more. The request was terse, controlled, and careful, not a bridge, but a small crack in the wall. Richard arrived at a quiet cafe, far from the building and the hospital, choosing a neutral ground to avoid intimidation or pressure. When he saw Daniel enter, he stood, heart pounding, unsure how the young man would react. Daniel's expression was guarded, eyes wary, jaw tight, every gesture radiating skepticism and self-protection. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Richard said softly, careful not to overstep. His usual confidence felt fragile under the weight. Of Daniel's scrutiny, Daniel slid into the seat opposite him, folding his arms. "Let's get one thing straight," he began, voice steady but cold. "I'm not here to accept anything, or to pretend I trust you. I'm here to hear what you have to say, that's it." Richard nodded, swallowing the lump of nerves forming in his throat. "I understand," he replied, "and I won't ask more of you than that. I just want to explain, to give you the truth from my side, the mistakes I made, the searches I conducted, the regret I've carried all these years." As Richard spoke, Daniel listened with a mixture of skepticism and cautious curiosity. He heard the stories of lonely nights spent searching for Anna, the remorse over missed milestones, and the longing to connect with the son he had never truly known. Every word chipped away at Daniel's anger just slightly, softening the sharp edges of years of distrust. Though the tension remained, the atmosphere shifted imperceptibly. Walls that had seemed impenetrable began to show cracks, subtle signs of possibility, of understanding, of tentative hope. Daniel was still cautious, still protective of his heart, but for the first time he allowed himself to consider the idea that Richard's words might not just be empty promises. By the time they left the cafe, the air between them was lighter, charged with the unspoken recognition that something new, something real had begun. It wasn't reconciliation yet, but it was a beginning. Just as Daniel began to cautiously lower the walls around his heart, a new threat emerged from an entirely unexpected quarter. In the world of business, information was currency, and secrets, even those buried for decades, could be weaponized. Richard Hale's rival, Victor Langston, had long coveted a deal that Richard was negotiating, and he had learned about Daniel through whispers and rumors in the corporate corridors. When Victor discovered the young janitor's connection to Richard, he immediately saw leverage. Victor called Richard late one evening, his voice smooth, calculated, and cruelly patient. "I know about your son," he said casually, as if discussing the weather. "And I know how precious secrecy is to you, Hale. You have a choice. Either you comply with my demands, or everyone you care about, especially him, suffers the consequences." Richard's heart pounded. Every instinct screamed to protect Daniel, but the threat was tangible, dangerous, and tied directly to someone who had spent years undermining him professionally. He couldn't let Victor manipulate or harm his son, nor could he risk losing control of the empire he had spent a lifetime building. Meanwhile, Daniel, unaware at first, sensed tension when Richard called him urgently. "Daniel, we have a problem," Richard explained cautiously. He revealed the threat without exaggeration. Victor Langston had discovered the connection and intended to use it for blackmail, to manipulate both of them into surrendering key assets or making decisions against their will. Daniel's anger ignited, not at Richard this time, but at the audacity of someone trying to exploit his life and his father's empire. "You mean this is all about power and money?" Daniel demanded, clenching his fists. "They want to use me as a pawn in their games?" "Yes," Richard admitted, his tone grim. "But we can't let them. You and I, we need to be smart, careful. We need to protect ourselves and your mother. Victor won't stop, and if he finds any weakness, he'll use it." The stakes had shifted dramatically. What had started as a fragile personal reconciliation now carried the weight of danger, corporate warfare, and potential public exposure. The threat forced Daniel to confront not just his feelings toward Richard, but the reality that their lives, and their survival, were entangled in ways he had never imagined. As father and son began planning their next moves. A mutual understanding emerged. To survive Victor's schemes, they had to unite. Trust, once tentative, would be tested under pressure stronger than either had faced before. And the consequences of failure were no longer abstract. They were real, immediate, and potentially devastating. The threat from Victor Langston forced a shift in the fragile dynamics between Daniel and Richard. No longer could Daniel view Richard as a distant, unreliable figure from the past. He was now a partner in survival, a protector, and a strategist. Together, they began to plan a way to neutralize the blackmail, combining Richard's corporate acumen with Daniel's streetwise practicality and inside knowledge of the building and employees. Richard outlined a cautious strategy. "We can't confront him directly. He'll turn it into leverage immediately," he warned, eyes steady but serious. "We need proof, documentation, and a way to expose him without giving him any room to maneuver. And Daniel, I need your help. I can't do this alone." Daniel hesitated for a moment, the old wounds still raw, but he glanced at his mother resting quietly in her hospital bed and realized that fear or anger could no longer dictate his decisions. Protecting his family required action, not resentment. "Okay," he said firmly, "I'll work with you, but I'm not letting him manipulate us." Over the next few days, father and son worked in tandem, coordinating late-night stakeouts and carefully monitoring Victor's communications. Daniel used his knowledge of the building, its schedules, and its employees to anticipate Victor's movements, while Richard leveraged his network of trusted aides and legal contacts to build a case that could dismantle the blackmailer's leverage. As they strategized together, a subtle transformation began. Daniel noticed Richard's patience, his willingness to explain without condescension, and his genuine concern for Daniel's autonomy. Richard, in turn, observed Daniel's determination, intelligence, and fierce protective instincts. Mutual respect grew with each successful maneuver against Victor, each obstacle they overcame together. One late evening, after a small victory in retrieving crucial evidence from Victor's associates, Daniel looked at Richard and realized something had shifted inside him. He didn't fully trust him yet, but the walls of anger and skepticism had started to crumble. For the first time, Richard felt not like a distant figure from a past he could never change, but like a real father, someone who shared both risk and responsibility. By the time Victor realized his plans were being systematically dismantled, father and son had developed a silent, unspoken understanding, a bond forged not only by blood, but by shared struggle. For Daniel, this was the beginning of seeing Richard not as a billionaire who had abandoned him, but as a man capable of loyalty, courage, and perhaps most importantly, genuine care. In the fire of crisis, the seeds of reconciliation were quietly taking root. The morning sun filtered softly through the hospital room, casting a warm glow over the quiet scene. Anna lay peacefully in her bed, frail but serene, her breathing steady in its gentle rhythm. Daniel sat beside her, holding her hand, with a tenderness born of years of care, while Richard stood nearby watching with a mix of awe and reverence. The room was calm, almost sacred, as if the universe itself had paused to witness the moment. Anna's eyes fluttered open, and she smiled weakly, a soft light shining through her fatigue. "Daniel." "Richard," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "I can leave knowing you found each other." Daniel's chest tightened, tears threatening to spill. He reached out, squeezing her hand, silently promising her that he would honor her wishes. Richard stepped closer, his presence steady and supportive, yet respectful of the space Daniel needed. Anna's gaze lingered on him, her lips curving into a gentle smile. "You've both fought so hard. I felt through mistakes, misunderstandings, and time lost. But love has always been here. Don't let it slip away now." Daniel felt the weight of her words settle deep in his heart. For years he had been angry, wary, and closed off, but in this quiet moment, he understood the power of connection and forgiveness. His father, once a stranger, now stood as a figure of possibility, proof that family could be more than absence and regret. It could be resilience, commitment, and care. Anna's hand moved slightly, brushing Daniel's cheek, then Richard's. "Take care of each other," she murmured, her voice a soft echo. Then, with a final, serene breath, she slipped away, leaving the room filled with a profound silence. Daniel lowered his head, grief washing over him, but alongside it, a sense of clarity and acceptance. He turned to Richard, meeting his gaze with a mixture of sorrow and newfound trust. "I don't care about the money," he said quietly, voice thick with emotion. "I want you in my life because you're my father. That's enough." Richard's eyes glistened as he nodded, stepping forward to place a hand on Daniel's shoulder. In that moment, the years of separation, anger, and betrayal seemed to dissolve, replaced by the fragile but undeniable bond of family. As they stood together, side by side, Daniel and Richard knew that while the past could not be changed, the future was theirs to shape. Through struggle, truth, and the unwavering love of Anna, a family once fractured was finally restored, bound not by wealth or circumstance, but by love, understanding, and the unbreakable ties of blood. The story of Daniel Brooks and Richard Hale illustrates a truth that resonates far beyond the confines of wealth, status, or circumstance. True family is not defined solely by blood or money, but by love, forgiveness, and the willingness to face life's challenges together. Daniel's journey from skepticism and anger to tentative acceptance demonstrates that trust and reconciliation often take time, courage, and honesty. It is not instant. It is earned through actions and shared experiences. Richard's arc, too, is a powerful lesson in redemption. A man who had achieved extraordinary success in the business world, but had failed in the most personal and human of responsibilities, fatherhood, he shows that it is never too late to make amends. His willingness to acknowledge mistakes, to seek understanding, and to support Daniel not as a benefactor but as a father illustrates that redemption requires humility, patience, and genuine care. Throughout their story, the characters experience trials that test the boundaries of their relationship. Daniel's mother, Anna, serves as a moral compass, reminding them that love is more important than pride, and that forgiveness can bridge even the deepest divides. Her final moments emphasize that holding on to anger and resentment only prolongs suffering, while embracing connection and understanding fosters healing. The blackmail subplot with Victor Langston further reinforces the theme. External threats and manipulation can strain relationships, but working together to confront challenges strengthens bonds. Daniel and Richard's shared struggle against Victor allows them to transform a fragile connection into one rooted in mutual respect, loyalty, and courage. They learn that family is forged not only through joy, but also through adversity. Ultimately, the story teaches that wealth and social status cannot replace the fundamental human need for connection, love, and understanding. It shows that even when relationships are fractured by absence, betrayal, or misunderstanding, there is always an opportunity to rebuild and grow stronger. Redemption, forgiveness, and family are processes that require effort and intentionality. In the end, Daniel and Richard find that embracing these principles allows them to heal from the past, honor Anna's legacy, and step forward together. Their journey serves as a reminder to all that family, real family, is chosen and nurtured through compassion, commitment, and shared experience, proving that it is never too late to reclaim love and build meaningful, lasting bonds. Family is not always defined by bloodlines or wealth. It is shaped by love, forgiveness, and the moments we choose to be there for one another. Daniel and Richard's story reminds us that even after years of absence, broken trust, and hardships, relationships can be rebuilt. Through honesty, courage, and shared struggle, they discovered that connection and belonging are possible. No matter how fractured the past may seem, we witness how Anna's unwavering love guided both father and son toward reconciliation and how facing adversity together strengthened their bond. The journey from anger, skepticism, and mistrust to understanding, acceptance, and mutual respect teaches a universal lesson. It's never too late to embrace those who matter and to give relationships a second chance. Life often places us in situations where bridges need to be mended, hearts need healing, and forgiveness must be extended, not just for others, but for ourselves. Daniel's growth shows that opening your heart, even cautiously, allows for love to flourish in unexpected ways. Richard's journey demonstrates that owning our mistakes and taking meaningful action can turn regret into redemption. Together, their story is a testament to the transformative power of vulnerability, empathy, and genuine connection. In the end, what matters most is the effort we put into nurturing relationships, appreciating the value of family, chosen or given, and understanding that every second chance carries the potential to reshape lives. Moments of reconciliation, no matter how challenging, remind us that life's most meaningful bonds are built through patience, understanding, and love. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that it's never too late to reconnect, forgive or embrace those who matter, then share it. Let it inspire others to recognize the importance of family, the power of second chances, and the incredible potential for growth and healing in every relationship. Family can be found in the most unexpected places. Share this story if you believe in second chances.